cancer, a failing business, financial losses. Where is God when you need Him most? Hollywood filmmaker Terry Botwick experienced it all. Find out how he and his wife were victorious through it all in this week's TGIF Work podcast. How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Oz Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to have you in this week's podcast, and it's a delight to have my good friend Terry Botwick out of Los Angeles, and he is in the entertainment business. And Terry and I have known each other for several years, and when we were doing some ministry in Hollywood, Terry came across my path, and we just were able to develop a friendship from that ministry time. And he has been very successful in Hollywood with producing films, and was with CBS early in his career, and also was president of VeggieTales. Yeah, he was with VeggieTales for several years, and also with CBN, and helping them transition some of their programming. So he's got a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the entertainment industry. And it's interesting that a movie he created 5 years ago or so called Captive was a movie that he asked me to share a few thoughts at during the preview, and it turned out that I met Pamela at that preview, and we ended up getting married. So Terry has a lot to do with me getting married.
To Pamela, not Terry.
Yeah, to Pamela, not Terry. So Terry, good to see you, and thanks for taking some time today.
Yeah, glad to be with you. It's good to see you again, and we're talking at a time where everything's pretty much on lockdown, so it's good to get to see you.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I think you and I can both relate to what many people are going through right now. With many people are, faced with not being able to go into work, some being laid off, just medical issues, all sorts of calamity in their lives. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about your journey and how God has taken you through your own crisis series of events over the last 7, 8 years. Is that how long it has been from the time it started?
True.
Yeah. So I thought we would let our listeners hear your story, and we'll unpack some of the details of it. I want to ask specific questions about how you navigated those seasons, but give our people a little information on kind of what happened in your journey in being a success in entertainment, and then having some medical issues crop up in your family and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I think first, I think to understand the level of difficulty and challenges that we faced, it's first important to say that I came from a place of really great blessing first. I had this, without going too deeply into my history, I was a pretty rebellious teenager, and had grew up in a Jewish conservative home in New Jersey, and because of the rebellion and sort of anger that I had as a teenager and a young adult, I really sacrificed a lot of opportunities early. And so I say that only to say the blessing that I had. I mean, the amazing doors that God opened up for me in entertainment. I spent a few years in ministry. I came to the Lord in 1975 in the very first vineyard, and I actually was ordained and started the next two vineyards after the first one as a pastor, and then moved into the entertainment business.
Wow.
And that was I'll start by saying I've heard God, like guys in the Bible, we tend to think that they're hearing God all the time, but if you really read carefully, like people like Abraham, they've probably heard God a handful of times where it was undeniably God in their lives. And so that's similar to my experience in the 45 or so years that I've known the Lord now. And one of those was the Lord directing me to work in entertainment, but and that led to great blessing. You mentioned a couple of jobs. We built the Family Channel and took it public, and I ran the entertainment company, a global enterprise for the Hearst Corporation and CBS, and a number of other things, and have been fortunate enough to be responsible for several thousand hours of content. And the only reason that's important is because you can live in those moments of blessing and still feel like you are walking with the Lord and right with the Lord. But it's so subtle how, pride and other things can creep into your experience as you accomplish things in life. And so about 8 years or so ago, I had launched a film fund. It was a large $400 million film fund. And then had gone through some struggles, but we were doing very well overall. And one day in prayer, I heard the Lord distinctly say to me, "If I take everything from you, will you still love me?" And I thought, in my brain, I thought, well, I know the answer to that question. Sure, I'll raise my hand, pick me, I can answer that. But shortly after that, I started to experience things disappearing. I started to go through some financial hardship, and things that were going well in my career weren't going so well anymore. And and then, my first reaction was, oh gosh, Lord, this wasn't a theoretical question. This is real life now. And so, and in the beginnings, all of that seemed manageable, but it really occurred over a number of years. So, the challenges got harder and harder and harder. And you referenced the health issues. One day, after experiencing just some, pain in her stomach, and then sort of similarly in her back, my wife had gone to get checked up several times, and the doctors, were putting her through various tests, and I thought, oh my God, I'd finally given her an ulcer or something like that. But eventually it turned out to be that she had a tumor that had developed in her small intestine and spread throughout her body. Ultimately, the tumor was like the size of a grapefruit. And the difficult thing is, in our bodies, until something like that is pressing against something where there are nerve endings, there aren't nerve endings in your organs. And so something could be growing and you don't know it until you experience pain. And so she had to have a massive surgery. When they tested her blood, she was stage 4. The cancer had spread everywhere. She had 2.5 years of some of the most extreme chemotherapy I've ever heard of. Ultimately had a second major surgery. And during that process, when she was first diagnosed, because I had heard the Lord say, if I take everything from you, that was the context for me. And so I thought, that she was going to die. And so I also thought, that I had to try to be strong for her, for better or worse. People react differently. You could either, you should, I guess, be strong, but you can either kind of, weep with those who weep, go through it together, or you can try to be a rock, and everybody's different. And I tried to be a rock, and I would do my praying and wrestling in the middle of the night. And so one night I, had this 2 or 3 hour session with the Lord in the middle of the night. And I can't say that I heard God speak in that moment, but at the end of that wrestling and prayer with God, I had a conviction and a confidence that she would be okay that, I did not muster up. It was, um, maybe what the Bible calls a gift of faith, or, when the Bible talks about faith being substance, it felt like that. And I'd never really felt anything like that before. So the last thing I'll say about this before we move on is it also probably made me a little insensitive because I was so sure that she would be fine, but yet she had to still go through the hardship, and the really terrible ordeal that she was going through. And so, but anyway, so we went from, great blessings financially, career that, kind of was sort of the golden boy at CBS and other places, to all of that sort of drying up, and my wife's, health issues taking us to the brink of having to deal with maybe losing her. And so, all of that for me was in the context of God saying, if I take everything from you, will you love me?
What were some of the hard choices that you guys had to make in the midst of all that?
Well, I mean, there's many. I would say, with respect to her health, it's, we're all going to go be with the Lord someday. And so it's a matter of how and when. And so facing mortality when it's real, when a doctor says, her cancer had spread in her pancreas. Most people with pancreatic cancer don't live more than 5 years. And so it becomes very real at that point. And with the financial hardship we were going through, we had owned 7 or 8 different houses in our lives. The house that we were in we'd been in for about 20 years or so. And we had to face the decision to sell the house because we had a fair amount of equity in it and needed to get access to that money. And there weren't many other options that, I'd explored many, but there really weren't many other options to get access to that cash. And so that was a big challenge. Whatever savings we had, before I made the decision to sell the house, we had to, go into savings that were laid up for retirement or things like that. So it was really, a sequence of very hard decisions that I would say, even if I tried to avoid them, eventually there's no avoiding them. You just have to make the hard decisions.
Yeah, I know that you and I remember those times where you and I talked a good bit, and we were just praying for some ray of hope or some breakthrough over, a deal or a project or an investment. And there was times there where there just wasn't anything happening. And, I think of that scripture, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And, sometimes without hope, we can really get down on God and get down on our circumstances. Um, what was able to keep you going during some of those hopeless times?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned hope, because I think hope in many ways is sort of the most powerful force in the universe in a way. And you can get to a point in going through challenges, and I know other people's stories are similar, where actually I was reading Frederick Buechner this morning, and he talked about something that I thought was applicable to our conversation. He used this analogy or a metaphor of an airplane taking off, and it's a really stormy, dark, cloudy conditions, and the plane is bumpy to the point where you are fearful, and you can't see anything out the windows. The visibility is next to zero. And but eventually, you go through this dark, bumpy ride and you get through the clouds, and on the other side of it, it's smooth and it's clear, and you get this ray of sunshine. And in those moments where it's just, bumpy and dark, God, for whatever reason, just can be very silent and very invisible. And it seems like, if you call out to God, you expect some sort of an answer, whether it's through someone else or some sort of a circumstance, or hearing God or sensing God directly. And sometimes it's just not true. Sometimes it's just dark and bleak. And it leads you, David talks about the valley of the shadow of death, and you feel like there is no hope. And so, I think about faith, hope, and love, and I think of love as being the reason, like love is the why, and faith is the what that gets us there, and I think that you sometimes just get to the very essence of faith, where you are you can't see it all, and you just basically have to cling to what you know to be true. And it's just not necessarily true in your emotions, and it just takes you down to the very essence of it. And so, and that can go on for a while, much longer than you think. But that's where faith becomes tested as true faith. It's much easier to have faith if you have some line of sight on where you're going, and ultimately faith is not in the what that you're hoping for. Faith is in the who. And so, ultimately your faith has to just be in the nature of God, who he is in his nature, as opposed to what it is that you're hoping to have change in your circumstances.
Yeah, we often talk about the Joseph calling being a calling that's earmarked by adversity. Joseph, obviously thrown into the pit, was in slavery until God's ultimate deliverance of him for an 80-year assignment that God would use him for. You guys turned the corner. God has proven faithful in both uh, your situation, your wife's situation. In fact, why don't you give the report on where Maan Seed is today?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, she's, her doctors won't use the words remission, and they won't use the words cancer-free, but there's been no sign of any cancer movement for probably, right now, it's probably about 4 years since she stopped taking chemotherapy. So 5 years from when you stop is a major milestone. And, she's healthy, she hikes, she eats what she wants, does what she wants. And
That's great. Well, I
yeah,
remember
but
those dark times. They were dark.
it was dark. It was, I mean, she spent a period of time before her second surgery where literally she was like a cadaver with skin hanging off of her. I mean, it was just, I've never seen anybody in that condition, really.
Yeah, it reminds me, the scripture says that God will never leave us nor forsake us, but he never said it wouldn't feel like it sometimes,
Yeah, true.
and we all feel that way sometimes. And, how are you and maybe Monsita different for going through that time?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that for me, I, uh, I have, well, first of all, a dose of humility. When you're riding high, you think you understand humility, but humility is really about seeing yourself in a proper relationship and a proper relation to God. So what that means is, in the end, I can only control very little. And most everything in life is under God's control, as opposed to my control. And so, I mean, obviously he controls everything, but as it relates to what I can control in the grand scheme of things, it's very little in relation to God. And so I think humility is the recognition of that and the acceptance of that. And ultimately, when you're in those situations and you're fighting so hard, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't do everything you can, but ultimately there's a point where you just basically have to surrender and recognize that it's in God's hands and the outcome is in his hands. And no matter what that outcome is, it doesn't change who he is in the universe. And it doesn't change our relationship with him. It just changes our circumstances. And so, for me, humility in seeing God in a proper relationship to myself has been a big part of it. At the same time, I have a much more settled confidence in the person of God, not necessarily in what I expect him to do or not do for me. The last thing I'll say for myself is that there's a recognition. It's an amazing paradox that life is incredibly fragile. Like if you look at the situation the world is in now, you see entire countries being frozen and on lockdown, and global financial economic disaster. Everything is so fragile. In a heartbeat, it all changes. And yet at the same time, life is incredibly resilient. Maan Seed could be on the brink of death one day, and the next day, she's hiking and healthy and, has been resilient. So, those are the kinds of lessons I've taken away. I think for her, I think all those things are true. I think it's also a little different because she had to reconcile for herself, mortality in real time, and what that means for seeing your kids, your grandkids, and the things you love in life. And so, I think there's what's important, what isn't important. I think there's a lasting psychological change that comes from going through something like that. But I think all that's good, all that's deep stuff.
God gradually turned your career in the positive direction. It was really very lean there for a number of years. Um, how much of that was from your efforts versus you see God just beginning to cause things to come across your path? And uh, how do you see that?
Well, I don't think my efforts have ever changed. If anything, I should probably work less. My efforts have always been, to really work hard and do everything you can to make something happen. The business I'm in is an incredibly hard business. It's gotten harder and harder and harder over the years. And it's, it has very little to do with the quality of your projects or anything else. It's just, you have something that somebody else thinks they need at a given moment. And so I've always had to work hard, and I still do. But the difference is purely God deciding to bless the work of your hands. It's the same projects that I, had been struggling with all of a sudden, are gaining traction. Projects that somebody else started have come to my doorstep and said, would you come on and help us with this? And, that just wasn't happening for, several years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So somebody's looking at this session today, and they're either unemployed or they may have even gotten this virus, or have some type of illness in their family. They're in crisis. What would you say to those people that find themselves at that place today?
Well, the first thing I would say is, I've learned that um, a relationship with God is not a formula. And oftentimes you can be in a church or in a church community, and there's so much discussion around what you should do, what you shouldn't do, the spiritual disciplines you should have, and all those things seem to become easily formulaic as a way that we relate to God. And I would say that I'm not saying that prayer is important. Reading the Bible is important to understand the nature of God, but the Bible points you to God, and so in the end, there's no formula. Um, you have to choose to pursue God, to be close to God, and to understand God as He truly is, not as we want Him to be. Um, Sometimes, again, in churches and different settings, we get these notions of who God is, and they're popular and they feel good, but they may not be true. We can be sincere and be sincerely wrong. And so, in the end, these difficult times should cause us to ask the difficult questions that can only be answered in the presence of God and understand who He is, as opposed to, back in the Old Testament, there's this verse that talks about when Moses is leading Israel through the desert, and it talks about the difference between God um, showing the Israelites His ways, but Moses knowing God. And there's a big difference, I think, that happens even in our experience in the church as we learn about things that seem to be the godly way to behave, but that's still very, very different than knowing God for who He is in His nature. And I think what God is after is that kind of relationship. So there's no formula when you're in a tough situation. You just have to get close to God. The second thing I would say is to resist the pride that would cause you to look for help in ways that are sometimes embarrassing. When you get down to the bottom, you sometimes just need help from somebody else, and God sometimes uses those somebody else's to help sustain you. And so, the ability to ask for help is you can be ashamed. It can be very embarrassing. But whether it's family or a small group of friends, I would say resist the pride that prevents you from asking. Um,
It reminds me when I went through my crisis, there were times where the events would happen and the conclusion was I would have this thought, well, if this happens, then that means this is going to happen. And
hmm,
it immediately took me to the pit
yeah.
and depression. Did you run into that quite often yourself?
Well, completely, because if you feel no hope, and you start questioning, the very essence of God, if I need you now, like if I've had experiences in the past that seem so mundane, like, hey God, I could use a parking spot, and one opens up, and yet here when I'm in the worst kind of crisis I can imagine, and I'm calling out to you, and what I get is silence. Like, who are you? And are you even there at all? Is this just a big joke? Have I just been deluding myself? And those are hard and sincere questions. And what I'll say is, God's not afraid of those questions. Um, he doesn't need to defend himself. He will answer them for each person in his own way, in his own time. Um, but that's the rubber meeting the road in terms of faith becoming real. And we shouldn't be afraid. And going back to the question about formula, some people think, you can't say or ask God certain things. And I'd say, there's probably nothing God hasn't seen or heard before. And if you're sincere and if you're in pain, just go. Whatever is true for you, that's your truth. Go.
Yeah. There's an interesting verse. I forget where it's located. It's in the Old Testament, but it talks about the God that hideth thee. You know, it's a very interesting verse. It sort of indicates that there's places where it seems like God is hidden, and our role is to seek Him and seek Him with all of our heart. And I think sometimes that God is setting the stage for us to do that in order that we can have a different kind of relationship with Him, for Him to reveal Himself in different places. If we look at the history of the Old Testament, we see real patterns where God is very silent to people, and then they're getting a major crisis, and God shows up at just the right moment. And
Well,
so,
when Jesus was born, it had been about 400 years since people in Israel had heard or seen God, had experienced God in a way. Oftentimes when the Old Testament talks about God speaking, it's usually through some prophetic voice. And it had been 400 years since they really heard anything from God. And that's a really long time for a nation that is carrying the banner of reflecting God to the rest of the world to have silence.
yeah. Well, you've been hearing from Terry Botwick, and no matter where you are in your journey, God is still God, and He wants to be part of that journey. And I'm going to have Terry pray for us today, that uh, he's going to pray for some of you that maybe find yourself in that difficult place, to be able to grab a hold of his shirt tail, that coattail, that that's all we can do sometimes. And sometimes we're looking for the grace of God for the next 5 minutes or the next 5 hours, the next 2 days, no matter where you are. Sometimes, the crisis can be that level of crisis. So Terry, how about praying for those folks out there that may be going through such a crisis?
Sure. Heavenly Father, we are grateful that we don't have to have all the answers. God, you are creator of all things. You are the resurrector. You bring life from death. You bring into existence things from nothing. God, I pray for all those people that are going through hard times and wondering where you are and how to um, navigate the forks in the road in their lives, and when faith sometimes and wisdom seem to be at war with each other. And Jesus, you said, "Give us this day our daily bread," and in Proverbs, we learn from the ants who store up for a season when there's less available, and which is true. So God, I pray that you would speak directly to people that are in this difficulty and hardship right now, that like Jesus, they would do and see and do what the Father is doing, and that there's no formula, but that you would direct specifically in each situation right now, and that by your grace, you would ease their circumstances and bring life where there's seemingly death coming in all around them. You have the power to do that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, everybody, it's good to have you all today. And if you're listening by iTunes, just give us a rating so others will find us. And if you're on YouTube today, just become a member of our community there by subscribing. And if you are not part of the Change Agent Master Mentor Program, I encourage you to be part of that. You get access to guys like Terry that have real world experience and to help us navigate through these difficult seasons. So good to have all of you here today. And Terry, thanks for taking some time with me. And I'm so delighted that it's turned around and you're having a little more fun this time.
Well, it's life can seem like it's always a battle. It seems like it's always a fight. But the Bible also says the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. So, for all those listening, go after it.
Yeah, and he trains our hands for war, it says David in Psalm 144:1. So, he doesn't let us just practice. He puts us right in the middle of the battle.
Yeah,
All right.
amen.
Good to see you, man, and
All
take
right.
care, everybody.
Thanks, Oz. Appreciate it. See you soon.
Well, I hope that session was helpful to you. You know, Terry's been a good friend over the years, and I've watched him navigate through that very difficult season. You know, many years ago, I was told by a mentor of mine that I had a Joseph calling on my life. I said, "What in the world is a Joseph calling?" He said, "Well, it's a marketplace call that means that you're going to be a spiritual and physical provider to others." And so over the years, I've studied what he means by that, and I've learned what a Joseph calling is and how to walk in it. I believe that God is ushering in many Josephs right now during this difficult season in our nation. Maybe you have a Joseph calling on your life. A Joseph calling is earmarked by someone who their literal life is known by the adversity they've gone through. That would be the case of Joseph. When we think of Joseph, we think of him being thrown into the pit and going to jail for a crime he didn't do. And so, you know, that's a special type of calling. And I've done extensive teaching on that, and I've done a webinar on it that I want to make available to you at free of charge. If you'll go to the website, is thejosephcalling.com. It's about a 45-minute teaching. It'll go deeper in the things that Terry and I talked about today, and I know it'd be an encouragement to you, especially if you find yourself in adversity right now. I've found that over the years, people who are not in adversity don't want to know about adversity because they're fearful that it'll attract it. But those who are in adversity, they want to know how to get out of it, how to navigate the difficult season. And I know this webinar will be really helpful to you. So just go to the link there at thejosephcalling.com and you'll be able to access that teaching for free. So God bless, and I pray that God meets every need you have during this season. Take care.